Fantasy Animation is a completely free, online, educational resource dedicated to examining the relationship between fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. We publish blog posts from academics, animators and VFX artists for people to access, as well as these podcasts that take listeners on an informative but hopefully entertaining journey through the fascinating world of fantasy animation. To find out more, visit fantasy-animation.org or subscribe via your favourite podcast subscription service. While you're there, give us a quick like, click the subscribe button, or give us a quick review while you're at it, as we could always use the extra help. For now, do enjoy the show. Hello listeners and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I am within my human form, Alex Sargent.
I knew you were going to do this to me. And I'm of Pandora, Chris Holliday.
Yeah, navvy through to the core. Today, as we've already given away, we're talking about Avatar, James Cameron's behemothing blockbuster from about a decade ago now, which caused a stir with its innovative 3D effects and motion capture, as well as kind of its callback to kind of old, 18th, 19th century fantasy literature of things like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Last of the Mohicans. So there's a sort of looking back and looking forward structure to the movie that I found really interesting as a fantasy theorist. Chris, anything to talk about VFX-wise this week?
Yeah, well, we were saying just before we came on that the film is often held up as this sort of moment within Hollywood VFX, and also the ways in which it kind of blurs the boundary between animation and live action. I guess from my perspective, and jumping off of some of the conversations we've had on previous podcasts, I'm sort of interested in the relationship between the film's, I guess, anti-imperialist message, discourses of the post-racial, and then how that feeds into the way it sort of uses effects and the role of motion capture in that, the kind of stars that are mo-capped and the racial politics of that too.
Terrific. Well, if that weren't rich enough, we have our guest this week, Rupert Read, who is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of East Anglia, and he specialises in a wide range of topics from the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein to the contemporary climate crisis, making room for a discussion of a fantasy film or two, particularly in his most recent work, A Film Philosophy of Ecology and Enlightenment. Rupert, until recently, was a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion, and he's also been a national parliamentary candidate, European parliamentary candidate, and councillor for the Green Party of England and Wales. And his political activism and philosophy kind of feed into one, which I think makes him a really interesting person to talk to in terms of Avatar. So, Rupert, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Great to be here.
Well, let's start off because it's a long movie and it's hopefully a shorter podcast at least. So. Lots to get through. Let's start with Avatar then. Given your range of interests, given that your work is both kind of political and philosophical, it's both theoretical and practical, what's your experience and what's your relationship with the film Avatar? How does it feed into your sort of intellectual and political interests?
Well, Avatar was actually part of the way that my political interests and my philosophical interests were brought together, really. A generation ago, when I was a much younger person, I had these kind of two things. I did my philosophy and I did my Wittgenstein and philosophy of science and so on, and they didn't really join up. But Avatar helped me to join them because it helped me to see literally, and that's what it's all about, of course, really seeing, to see the way in which it was possible and necessary to talk and think more about the world as the earth, as the place where we necessarily are. Because I think that's what Pandora is really. It's not really another planet at all. It's this planet as it still is and as it should be and as it could be. And when I saw Avatar, I was enormously looking forward to it. I thought this is going to be an event at the cinema, and I wasn't disappointed. And I know a lot of other people who felt the same way. And I really kind of thought at the time, wow, maybe this could really change something in our world. And I kind of think that if there'd been more of a movement or an effort around the issuing of Avatar at the time to take advantage of the impact that it had, then it could have changed quite a lot of stuff, because it had an enormous impact on a lot of people. One of the ways I know this is that it wasn't just me and some of my mates who were enormously impressed with it. I spent a bit of time, for example, watching the hashtag Avatar on Twitter at the time of the film's issuing, and it was extraordinary. It really looked very different from the buzz around most films. People were saying all sorts of intriguing things. Like, I saw somebody saying, for example, I've watched Avatar and I've decided now not to join the army. I saw another person who said, wow, just come out of Avatar, I was thinking of getting a 4x4, but now I'm not going to get one. This is pretty unusual, to have fictional films really seeming to make some kind of impact on people's life choices. So, yeah, there's a smattering of thoughts and themes for us to begin with. I think this film was an event. It was certainly an event in my life. I think it could have been even more of an event if it had been taken advantage of. And one of the reasons I'm still interested in Avatar is that myself and my colleague, the film theorist Peter Kramer, we have this idea, we call it the Avatar Project. We have this idea of trying to key into when the long awaited sequels finally come, to see if we can actually get some more political vibe going around the issuing of those, and maybe they can make a more systematic difference to the world even than the original film made.
I think it's great to talk positively about a big popular text, because I think, sometimes our listeners get frustrated at us when we critique films that are sort of, so offer themselves so off just as sites for popular entertainment. And you're right. I mean, I remember, we'll talk about the ecological kind of substance of the movie, but I can remember, a Palestinians movements kind of dressing up as Navi, kind of warriors, as kind of an expression of solidarity and an expression of community and things like that. And that's kind of part of a wave of, popular fantasy, whether it be the sort of V for Vendetta masks, or, these kind of symbols of fantasy entertainment that are then used for very real political purposes. So we can go to the philosophy, we can go to the politics, but I guess I'm interested in picking up on a thread what you said there. If only the kind of opportunity of the movie had been realised. So what do you think happened to not realise that? Was it grumpy academics like us kind of just kind of dismissing it and not going with it, or was there some sort of problem with how the movie kind of worked politically or socially to stop the potential radical change that the film at least seems to suggest politically?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you need political organisation around things to make the most of them. And you're right, there were organisations and movements that picked up on Avatar. It happened in Palestine, it happened in various other parts of the world, including among the Dongria people in India, who were trying to stop a brutal mining enterprise. So it was very directly relevant to them. Of course, fascinatingly, Avatar was in effect banned in China. And the reason for that, it's pretty clear, was that the Chinese government was afraid it might ignite land protests against land grabs. So there was some very real political effect from the film. But what I was getting at was, I think there could have been so much more if it had been deliberately built on. I think also, as you say, Alex, there was some semi-deliberate pushback of various kinds publicly against the film. So there was the Chinese government actions. There was a lot of agitation against the film in the United States from right-wing political forces, especially Christian evangelical groups. And then there was the pushback against it from various among the left and from the academic world, some in the identity politics world. And my message to those people, including Zizek, who I don't think even actually saw the film and wrote very ill-informed stuff against it, my message to those people is, look, be very careful when you've got allies like the Chinese government and like Christian evangelical right-wing zealots in the United States. Do you really want those people as your allies? I think that the criticisms which Zizek and various left-wing academics and so on made against Avatar, which I address in my book, were mostly wrong-headed. Of course, it's always possible to pick holes in any big blockbuster film, just as if you've got enough mind to do so, you can do that the same with any art house film, frankly. But I think this film was far more than just entertainment. And what I'm interested in doing with films like this and films like Lord of the Rings and Gravity and some of the other popular films I talk about in my book is really accentuating the positive and thinking sort of ingenuously with the film about what the film is seeking to accomplish. And I think Avatar does something quite extraordinary. I just taught it again to my students a few weeks ago at the University of East Anglia. One of the things I really dwelt on and that they really absorbed, I think, was some of the fascinating way that point of view is used in the film. For example, the fact which I note that none of the critics of the film note, except possibly the right-wing American critics, that when you see the death of Quaritch, the villain character in the film towards the end, you experience that briefly from his point of view. The second arrow that hits him to kill him, that's a direct point of view shot of the arrow coming towards you. And whoa, what's going on with that? My reading of that is that at that moment it's the sort of final gesture of an attempt to sort of kill the American imperialist within you or within us all, and to make clear that we're implicated among those who we wouldn't want to be feeling ourselves as on the side of in the film. And so in this sense, it seems to me that actually the right-wing evangelical critics of the film who say it's anti-American and the Chinese government, they are in many ways more accurate viewers of the film, it seems to me, than Zizek and some of the other academic critics of the film, because they get that this film really is an extremely powerful piece of propaganda, but much more than just propaganda, because I think the way it works is often quite careful and subtle. The film is an extremely powerful piece of argumentation, as it were, against anti-ecological perspectives on the world, against imperialism, and for a very different way of feeling ourselves in relation to the planet, frankly.
Just picking up on kind of some of your points, I was struck by how it maps really nice. And what a lot of my notes are about fantasies of control. And actually, I think your point about the kind of POV shots that punctuate a lot of the ways that characters see, and of course the way that we see. A lot of my notes are around kind of fantasies of control, surrogacy, perception, bodily illusion, but also the idea of trust, the trust that we place in bodies and people. And of course this is then amplified by the fact these are digital bodies. In terms of the sort of the epicness of the film, quite soon after the film was released, there was a special issue of a journal which was all about Avatar, and the first paragraph of that, the introduction, talks exactly about, it's the budget of the film, the highest box office gross, the highest number of DVDs and Blu-rays sold, that were sold on Earth Day to kind of coincide with the films. And this is William Brown and Jenna Eng's introduction to a special issue of Animation and Interdisciplinary Journal that talks about the way that home video tied in with its sort of ecological narrative, worldwide release on a number of screens, winner of Oscars, and also how its significance lies in what they term the kind of as a high profile example of contemporary Hollywood's globalized industrial practice. So clearly the film is epic in the way that we might understand definitions of the blockbuster and all this kind of stuff. But then I was thinking about the film towards the end of the first decade of the 21st century, ways I think that you can read the film in relation to its technology of motion capture, which Alex mentioned at the start, where motion capture was towards the end of 2008, 2009, the way that I suppose animation studies, writers on animation thought about motion capture as a technology of illusion. The fact that this film was released the same year as a film called Surrogates, a very interesting film that stars Bruce Willis that is about fantasies of control, where a white guy, James Cromwell, acts and performs as a black guy, Ving Rhames, and it's very interesting to locate the 2008-2009ness of Avatar in relation to the post-racial Obama motion capture, the kinds of films that were dominating at the box office, Harry Potter, animated films of various kinds. So I found it really, and the way that the film, I suppose, reflexively acknowledges that through I think there's a line that talks about the kind of puppet show, one of the criticisms of the way that the humans and the Na'vi are integrating or working, and the idea of humanoids. So all this stuff around kind of surrogacy and avatars and puppetry, I find really, really fascinating. And I remember the film coming out, but not having seen it up until this podcast. So I'm trying to remember the impact. I remember Ben Stiller turning up at the Oscars dressed as a Na'vi. I remember that, and the way that the film was sort of held up as this moment. But I think you're both right that retrospectively, it's got a bit of a not bad, but it seems fair game in a way that a lot of other blockbusters, and let's not forget Iron Man is the year before this, so we're off into Marvel really, and I just wonder what it was about this film that seems to have attracted. Is it something to do with Cameron? Is it something to do with the blockbuster as this category? And you mentioned Peter Kramer. I know kind of Peter's interested in the economics and the kind of business of Hollywood as much as anything, and I'm just trying to wrap my head around why a film that could be so held up in lots and lots of different ways and in lots of different kind of contexts certainly has it's kind of so popular that no one likes it, or people don't like it, or it's pushed to the side in a particular kind of way. So I don't quite have any answers to that, but there's a lot going on with this film.
Yeah, well, so I do think I have one or two answers to that. I think it's a really important question. I've thought about it a lot. I think that there is a snootiness among academics, and a snootiness among left-wing and sort of right-on and sort of woke politics, which has been going on for quite a while. It's not a very recent phenomenon, although it has become more extreme sometimes recently. And the snootiness, one form it takes is this: if something's popular, then it can't be good, because the people are always basically wrong, and you have to be a super clever left-wing academic or political activist like me to see through the nonsense which always takes in the people and the way that they are always suborned to ideologies which they don't understand and which are imposed on them by way of films. I think this is a very dangerous anti-democratic point of view. I think it's a point of view that doesn't take seriously the following possibility that I think is very real, that it is sometimes the case, I'm not saying it's always the case by any means, but that it is sometimes the case that something is popular because it's good. And this is a thought which has been very difficult to state in academia for a long time. The idea that people might actually be able to perceive and experience quality. And I've been thinking about this a lot for a long time in relation to Avatar, also recently, and been writing on it recently in relation to Gravity, which I think experienced some similar difficulties. And I think it's interesting to compare the two precisely because they're basically the only two really high quality, I would argue, 3D films of a mass level of impact that there have been so far, which might be quite surprising. And I think that both of them do this incredible job of placing you inside a world. In Avatar, it's the world of Pandora, which is sort of our world through a glass, brightly, if you will. And in Gravity, of course, it's outer space. But again, the real point is coming home. And in this way, both of them are, in a certain sense, sort of, as I see them, and I talk about this in the book, sort of remakes or refashionings of the central ideas of 2001, A Space Odyssey, which I think has succeeded much more easily in being recognized widely as a really great film. So, yeah, I think that too many people think that if something is popular, if something has a large budget, then it can only be assessed as ideology, as propaganda of the purest time and purest kind, and as entertainment. I call this point of view entertainmentism, the idea that anything that is that is inter alia entertaining cannot be good, cannot be worth taking seriously, and must be picked apart. And I take a very different view, and I think that Avatar actually gives us access to certain kinds of ancient wisdoms that we are much in need of. I think that people, many people who saw it, felt a lot of the importance and the reality, if you will, of it, and understood the sort of the Avatarian journey that the film was taking one on. And in that sense, it seems to me that it's important to, if you will, defend not just the film, but the film's viewers against those who would have this snooty attitude and dismiss it. And I think that such people are missing out on a great deal which is potentially available to us in popular culture.
Yeah, no, I agree. I really enjoyed, and part of the reason I enjoyed it was about, and then maybe this ties into what you were saying about the way that we historically understand spectacle. And I know that both Alex and I have taught an article when we were doing Gone with the Wind, which obviously in terms of epics and this film is doing things in terms of scale that is and spectacle that is kind of remarkable and still remarkable, as you say, 10, 11 years after it was released or whatever. But I remember Tom Brown's article about Gone with the Wind and the meaning of spectacle, i.e. that spectacle is being, we know that the way that spectacle works is that it interrupts the narrative, and narrative is the bit that we all love and enjoy, and then the spectacle comes in and narrative is stopped, and there is a sort of stop and stare moment. Spectacle and narrative proceeds on this forward trajectory in a way where, if that's the horizontal, spectacle is the vertical that interrupts moments of narrative engagement. And Tom Brown's article on Gone with the Wind is about, okay, well, let's try and imbue meaning into spectacle. Spectacle must do something. And all of Avatar, as I was watching it, I thought this is kind of, in terms of its imagery, its VFX imagery, its kind of use of scenes that exploit the 3D space, the way that movement works, control. And I thought there's so much that is spectacular about this film. I can't not analyze, I can't not analyze the spectacle. I can't not do something with the spectacle and think politically about what the spectacle is doing in relation to ideas of identity and race and imperialism and the stuff that's been written on Avatar certainly talks about exactly the point that you made, that the film projects these kind of earthbound racial and colonial conflicts into outer space. It's a fantasy animation that simplifies through spectacle historical colonialism. And part of that's where the meat and potatoes of the film is that it's really a really interesting, it's a bit corny in the unobtainium, okay, fine, but I think the film gets a lot of course
quite deliberate, right?
Yeah,
that's so obvious that it's like a sort of a nod to the audience and a sort of a knowing kind of joke. So it seems to me that there were a few people who said, they couldn't even be bothered to think of a real name for the mineral or something. And such people, I just thought, oh my God, you're so sort of dead-eared, you're so tin-eared to what's going on here. I thought that unobtainium was a lovely little trick, actually.
I suppose on the notion of fantasy, I mean, I've obviously noted down the obligatory Wizard of Oz reference that seems to occur in most films. We're not in Kansas anymore, we're in Pandora, so I know Alex is happy for this episode. But I was thinking about when Alex and I have talked about the meaning of kind of fantasy, and that fantasy is the idea of fantasy is that it only means something when you can read it politically. And that political reading saves fantasy from being just about something else. And so obviously this film is about it's about race, it's about passing, it's about the performance of the other, it's about kind of the symbolic interspecies, interracial, anti-colonial love story. But I'm just wondering whether this all ties into the way that fantasy has been understood politically, and the way that political readings kind of save. That's how interpretation works. You save and recuperate a film that people have been missing, but when we read it politically, we can actually do something with it. And I wonder whether that chimes with with fantasy, Alex, in the way that I know that you've spoken about the role of fantasies that might mean something.
Well, sort of, yeah. Just to embellish that point, I think from my perspective, I think Avatar is at its most interesting when it's at its least narrative. In that the narrative mechanics, as you said, Rupert, are kind of deliberately kind of, you know, surface level scaffolding to something much more interesting.
Yeah.
You know, we have a story that's been told loads of different times. It's quite kind of, you know, it's quite folkloric. It's quite, as I say, it has shades of Nathaniel Hawthorne and early 19th century American writers. It's you know, Last of the Mohicans. It's Fern Gully. It's all the things that were the film. So it's silly because it's these movies again. But as I think you're right, Rupert, and I think that's not what the film is. Like, the film uses that scaffolding to create these series of effective moments and sequences within the film. And I think even detractors of the movie would agree with that, and that they would say that, well, that's just meaningless spectacle, when I think Chris is right. We should make that quite meaningful as an experience. And I think
I think that's right. Something I talk about in the book is again how it's important that the film, to get its full effect, you do need to see the 3D version of it at least once. The immersiveness of it was deeply impressive and affecting. And this is one of the levels at which the film works in terms of its title and its concept. You know, there are these multiple ways in which you have this idea of us needing or having or becoming or being avatars for ourselves or one another gets played out. There's a religious or spiritual meaning to the concept of avatar, a representative of the divine upon earth. And there's obviously the way in which Jake, the protagonist, and others get to inhabit these avatar bodies. And then finally, at the end, he actually seeks to leave behind his human form altogether. And all of these kinds of ways in which there is a serious effort at immersion, at understanding the other, and a serious representation of how difficult that is. You know, people sometimes say, it's sort of, there's sort of appropriation going on in Avatar because he sort of literally steps into one of their bodies, and the response to that, it seems to me, is, well, look how desperately badly he fails. First at inhabiting the world, the Pandora world at all, such that he's actually on the point of dying, of being killed, until Neytiri comes along and saves him. And she says to him repeatedly, you know, you're like a baby, you don't understand anything, etc. And secondly, building on that, the way in which he goes through this incredible kind of painful journey of falling in love, of becoming impressed with this other way of being against his better judgment, but then of also betraying it, and of having to go through this really kind of difficult process of trying to kind of win back trust, because he's actually failed to leave behind his American imperialist whatever prejudices nearly enough for the majority of the film. So there's no kind of simple step of kind of appropriation here. On the contrary, it's a difficult, painful journey of learning, and it's connected with the concept of what I've called reverse anthropology, of not going and studying the natives, but going and learning from the indigenous peoples and wisdom that we've forgotten, and so on and so forth. And that requires a kind of humility, which is absent in most of the history of imperialism, obviously, but is also absent in most of the history of the academic world, which is why I think using this term reverse anthropology can be helpful to get us to see what's going on there. And the whole process, we use the term fantasy, but you know, I like to argue that in a very real sense, and I think this is what you were saying, Chris, there isn't any escapism going on here at all, actually. At the end of the day, it's the opposite of escapism. And that's why in the introduction to the book, I use these two quotes, which I think are very relevant to Avatar. So a quote from the great philosopher Iris Murdoch: "We use our imagination not to escape the world, but to join it. And this exhilarates us. because of the distance between our ordinary dulled consciousness and an apprehension of the real. I think you could apply that very clearly to Avatar. And then this quote from Alan Garner: myth is not entertainment, but rather the crystallization of experience. And far from being escapist literature, fantasy is an intensification of reality.
I'd like to briefly talk about 3D more because, well, one, it gives me an excuse to trot out ideas for an article I'm clearly never going to write because I've been sitting on it for about 10 years. But when there was that wave of 3D, and I was struck, there's so many ways we can come at the spectacle of Avatar, but one of the things that struck me, and I actually worked in a cinema at the time, so I was watching people come in and out and repeating the experience and stumbling out kind of dazed and all the kind of cliches you might expect. Was the kind of the repeatability of the experience, and that people were coming back and again to grab it, and that's that happens with lots and lots of sort of particularly big blockbusters. But what I found was there was this kind of preciousness to the experience because it was in 3D, and because the kind of distributive economics were the case that large amounts of people didn't have 3D televisions, they didn't have 3D technology at home, as has been only exemplified since. So what you had was this very odd kind of juxtaposition, and you had this kind of new media product that kind of meant we all got rid of our celluloid projectors and installed digital technology. But rather than reciprocating the kind of standard dynamics of digital, which is to make things easier to obtain and transferable across different media, and I can watch Avatar on my laptop, on my phone, probably can get it beamed into my head somewhere, all this kind of stuff. That required you to go to a place, sit and watch something, and know that in 2 years you're probably not going to be able to see it in that form again. Yeah. And there was this kind of sense of an event happening in a place and time that was very much tied to the sense of spectacle and seemed to me very interestingly anti-commercial, anti-consumable, and because it kind of dramatized the kind of preciousness of an individual moment as people kind of came in and watched this film. They knew that they had to kind of take it all in now, because in 2 years or in 6 months or whenever, their memories will fade and it will end. And I don't know, there's something about the fact that the film was in 3D that charges the spectacle with some of the stuff we're talking about and makes it very interesting in terms of its relationship to kind of, consumer culture, new media culture, and all the things that supposedly it should be championing by being this great big digital kind of beast.
Yeah, I think you're right. One of the ways I'm interested in the sort of political potentialities of cinema is the fact that we go and see films together in the cinema, and we have this kind of shared, deep, immersive experience in the darkness. There's something kind of almost ritualistic about it. Something quite unusual about it in relation to our broader culture today and some of those other trends that you're mentioning there, Alex. And I think you're right that is particularly so for a film that is in 3D. So, I think that is something, again, kind of precious. Again, one of the reasons perhaps why it hasn't been as widely understood or discussed as it might have been is that it's almost kind of scary or awe-inspiring, or it kind of connects us to things that we're a bit nervous about, the kind of shared rituals from our past, and some kind of sense that maybe some of those rituals had their literally kind of darker side as well. I think that the way in which people got to experience Avatar together is important, and I think that it's really important that in the COVID era, we don't lose those kinds of experiences. I think it's really important that the cinema and the theatre and so forth are preserved, and that we realise just how important they are to us as beings who are far, far more than separate, atomised individuals.
And I think perhaps that there's a more interesting way of connecting the film to the sort of legacy and history of fantasy, in that you can go back to sort of literature examples of 200 years ago, but perhaps it's more interesting to go back to kind of, you know, folkloric storytelling, because that's it, isn't it? It's exactly the same thing in that it's communal, it's shared, it's effective,
Yes.
and the structures of the tale are the things that are known, and everybody already knows that. Those are the playing grounds for these effective, dynamic, cultural, communal experiences that we could kind of map onto the kind of experiences people were having with Avatar.
So this is one of the connections I make to Lord of the Rings. It's more than just the hero's journey. It's the creation of a sort of new myth, which is based on old myths and old traditions of storytelling. It's the way that if you look at the structure of the story of the Lord of the Rings, it's unbelievably simple, and also in a way kind of unbelievably kind of artificial, almost stupid, as has often been mentioned, and as I discuss it in my book. All they need to do actually is hitch a ride on one of the eagles in the first place and just shoot off to Mount Doom and dump the ring straight in there. But of course that would spoil the whole quest and the whole potentiality for death and rebirth and a reworking of a kind of closeness to the earth and a reworking of kind of community and so on, which are the actual sort of, you know, quasi-archetypal sort of Jungian kind of mythic kind of things that are going on in it. And somewhat similar remarks could be made about Avatar in terms of a sort of shared quasi kind of folkloric experience. Is again, of course, that is what the kind of central opposition that is being kind of offered or portrayed in Avatar is kind of all about. You've got a kind of confrontation between a culture of pseudo-individualism. I say pseudo-individualism because, of course, our culture and American culture isn't really even a proper culture of individualism. It's actually a culture of massive conformism, but a culture of pseudo-individualism which supposedly valorizes the freedom to consume and exploit and so on and so forth, against a culture of attunement and togetherness and community and, in the best sense, tribalism. So it's almost as if the way in which we're brought together by the experience of watching Avatar is yet another sort of Avatarian kind of metonym for the message, if you will, of the film, the possibility that's being offered by the reverse anthropology that it gestures at.
I wanted to go back to because the Murdoch quote where, and I guess this chimes with Alex's interest in that fantasy matters and that it's real, and obviously one of the things that Avatar does is kind of reverse the polarities, and the mission reverses the polarities, whereby the real world, and this is manifest, I think, in the film's colour palette, you know, the real world becomes increasingly illusory to this disillusioned protagonist, whereas the world of Pandora becomes increasingly sort of real, whilst at the same time, for us as spectators, we never lose the fact that it is an illusion, but my goodness, it's a real illusion. And there's something about the film's acknowledgement of the fantasy of both spaces. And I wonder whether, because you talked a little bit about the sort of complexities of the film, because I think for me, watching a first viewing, the sort of links to race are of course clear. If we think about Obama, this sort of post-racial refrain that the inauguration of 44th president is sort of ushering in this truly democratic post-racial moment. And then looking at the film in terms of its casting and we talked a little bit about this when we did the podcast on Happy Feet and the erasure of Labour and specifically black Labour, the way that the Navis, Zoe Saldana, CCH Pounder, Wes Studi, Laz Alonso. So we have an American Dominican, a Guyanese American, a Cherokee American, and a black actor in Alonso playing the other Navi, and so it's sort of difficult not to see the film quite explicitly in these terms. But from what you're saying, it seems like the film is trying to do something with that discourse. It's trying to talk about, potentially, I don't know, the fantasy of the post-racial. So it's not. And writing around the film has sort of tied it into films, as wide-ranging as The Blind Side from 2009. Again, a film that sort of ushers in we've solved racism, tick, we're colourblind. And of course, the problem with colourblind racism is that if you're colourblind, you don't see patterns. And so I'm trying to get my head around what the film is doing in relation to the post-racial and the way is it a sort of simplistic reading to say, the film is just rehearsing these same old issues of racial difference, or is part of what it's trying to do play with those cultural discourses of the post-racial as they were circulating in America at the time?
Yeah, so obviously it's complicated stuff here and a lot going on, and I can only offer my own sort of interpretation of it. That interpretation would be that on the one hand, as I said before, and I do think this is very important, the central character who's our avatar in the film goes on a very long, difficult and painful hero's journey of kind of 2 steps forward and 3 steps back and so forth. And there's no easy way to get to the kind of point that the film is wanting you to get to, which is a point where you are actually in a position to start to take more seriously our need, which I believe is really profound, for some kind of return to indigenous wisdom, to some of the things which Native American peoples, for example, knew that we've managed to forget about long-termism, about what we owe to the land and owe to each other and owe to the past and owe to the future, and so forth. But then I think the film is also kind of suggesting that if we do that, then yes, there is the possibility for us to overcome and leave behind some of the narrownesses and constraining aspects of our identities and of race. And I think that's absolutely crucial. I think that if we stay forever in a sort of mentality of, well, these injustices and so on can never be overcome, can never be repaid, etc., then, as Nietzsche, I think, correctly argued, we're condemning ourselves to remain forever sort of hobbled and forever stuck apart from each other. There has to be the possibility of some kind of moving on and of some kind of creation of more harmonious relations between ourselves. And I think it is absolutely crystal clear that while there remain really horrible aspects of racism in our society and in our world and in our politics, I think it's absolutely crystal clear that in most countries of the world, including the US and the UK, the situation vis-a-vis race has on balance improved over the past generation or two. And Obama becoming president is merely one symptom of that. Whereas I think it's really important to be clear that the situation vis-a-vis ecology has drastically deteriorated over the last generation or two. So one of my sort of political philosophy missions, if you will, is to try to get us to a position, and this is difficult, but and has all sorts of hazards attached to it, but to try to get us to a position where we can see a little bit more clearly what the greatest obstacles and challenges facing us now are. Well, my argument in the book, and my argument, if you will, in my life and in my activism, is that actually the greatest challenge we now face is in some sort of coming together to stop ourselves from destroying our posterity and destroying our planetary home. And that, again, of course, is precisely what this film is all about. And one of the things which I think Extinction Rebellion has done rather well on balance, although it's not without its difficulties, is to suggest that at the end of the day, we do need to come together in a sort of broad-based movement across identities, across political commitments, etc., to face this civilizational emergency together. without recrimination, and that only some kind of attitude like that might manage to overcome some of the kinds of polarizations of our society and some of the kinds of attachments to identity, which at the end of the day, I think, are only harmful and only keep us in our boxes.
So I had a kind of question on that ecological, environmental dimension element. I was thinking, and I was talking to you briefly before we started, that there's a moment, I think it's just after Jake's told that his sort of new legs are, quote, a done deal, that he's going to get, which, you know, are also digitally enhanced. He is also a digital body before he becomes an avatar. But anyway, that what struck me is that so he's told that his new legs are a done deal, and then he takes part in a sort of indigenous ceremony, and he talks about, this is like the last step that I need before I'll become one of them, he says. And then there's a scene with him and Zoe Saldana's character where they're walking through what looks like this sort of digital farm of miles and miles of fiber optic cable. And I was thinking again about 2009 and technology, and so according to CNN, smartphones, portable gaming devices, the rise in ebooks. 2009 is the arrival of Microsoft's Bing as well. Individuals became publishers through the acceleration of Twitter, and so I was trying to get my head around the film as a sort of, this is, you know, the world of connection and the world of connectivity, and Alex mentioned earlier the sort of new media culture. Is there a paradox whereby a film that is so hyper technological, making claims about the environment, i.e. there's something paradoxical about a kind of digital farm? And so I'm just trying to, and I wonder whether that's part of why the film has been critiqued in certain kind of academic circles with regards to, well, it's one of the most technological films, i.e. what it was doing for motion capture in 2009. Part of the buzz around the film that feeds into its sort of imaginary status as this is Behemoth, as Alex mentioned right at the start. Is there a tension between, and I don't know, but is there a tension between this sort of hyper technological world of facade, control, connectivity? Does that undo some of the ecological work of the film or the environmental work of the film, or is the film sort of doing something quite obvious with that connection?
Yeah, so of course that tension is there, and of course people can make and have made a lot of it.
Yeah.
I guess what I would see as more important countervailing factors would be these. Firstly, what Alex and I were discussing before, to do with these intriguing ways in which the film actually portrays, evokes, metaphorizes, and makes real certain kinds of experience of connectivity and community. Secondly, the way in which the film portrays that in relation to the ecological world, and gives us really some very, very vivid, clear, explicit, powerful, immersive experiences of ecological connectivity, of ideas which, you know, are still very new to us, really, of for example, trees communicating with each other and kind of sharing various kinds of knowledge and mutual support and so on. You know, a generation or two, if you would have said that that trees do that to people, they would have said, well, you've obviously been taking too much of something. You know, that's not reality. But it is reality. We're finding out more and more about that reality. And the film brought that to public understanding pretty much for the first time. And finally, and this is really the place where I end my chapter on Avatar in the book, the really important way that the film poses a question to us at the end of it. And the way I see the question is this. So you have the battle at the end of Avatar, in which, and I think this is a very important fact, the Na'vi, the Rebel Alliance, lose. You think, well, they'll win the military fight because this is a film, right? And we're not going to have some kind of Ned Stark kind of horrible moment of mutual defeat and kind of sad ending here. And it turns out that you're half right, but you're also half wrong. I mean, in military terms, they lose the battle, and they only win because Awa herself, the Gaia's avatar in the film, rides to the rescue by bringing the planet's animals into the fray. Now, if one projects back from that to our own situation, I think it is clear to pretty much everybody, except people who really have taken far too much of something, that isn't going to happen on the Earth, right? So the film then poses implicitly the question to you: if we're going to get the right result here, how is that going to happen? Because it's damn well for sure not going to happen in the way that we've just portrayed it. The way we've just portrayed it is a metaphor. It's as it were what ought to happen. It would be wonderful if Gaia herself rose up and took a sort of, well, hopefully relatively painless revenge, to use to allude to the term that James Lovelock uses in his famous book. So we have to figure out how to do this. We have to figure out how to try to arrive at some kind of conclusion, which is a bit like the conclusion that gets arrived at in the film, but in a way that isn't just based in fantasy. And that takes one into all the methods of activism and politics and paradigm shift and so forth that relate to the fact, for example, that, as we mentioned earlier, a number of civil society movements have explicitly appealed to the film and said, look, our struggle is like this struggle. And then the way that the film poses this in its very final moments, as I see it, which is that Jake manages to successfully transmigrate into his Avatarian body, and the very final shot of the film breaks the fourth wall as he opens his eyes with the reference back to the way in which the film is over and over again about what it is to really see something, or to see someone, to see a being. He opens his eyes, and now for the first time he's looking directly at us, and it seems to me that is a posing of the question to us. Now, what are you going to do? What are we going to do to wake up? What are we going to do to manifest this kind of knowledge and experience that we've undergone vicariously, and more than vicariously, in the last 2 or 3 hours? And in that sense, it seems to me again that the film invites us kind of ingenuously into what would be a real politics of ecology and activism and at the very least life change of some kind or another, which, as I say, it seems that quite a lot of people did literally get the message from the film, and that seems to me to overcome these kinds of questions of, oh well, yeah, but does the end justify the means, and what about the hyper-technologism of the film and so on? The film invites you in more than one way in this kind of escalating, cumulative kind of fashion to reflect on what you've experienced and what you've learned and what you're going to do about it, and on what we're going to do about it, because it's absolutely, once again, categorically obvious from the film and from any kind of basic reflection on it that you're not going to get anywhere here unless you do it as part of some much broader collective.
I love what you were saying there, because I think it chimes with what I try to bang on about in the podcast, which is that, if fantasy storytelling means anything or can be separated from any other kinds of storytelling, it's because it presents us things we know are impossible. And that, therefore, is actually far more complicated and challenging than we often give it credit for, because watching images we know are impossible, as you just articulated so well, can in very ways confront us to think about ways to realize them, or to think about the reasons why they are impossible, and all these kind of things. So I think your reading of the ending is really kind of bang on exactly in how I tend to read fantasy anyway. So yeah, absolutely. I guess the final kind of fly in the ointment I would like us to address is that's all kind of, I think, that makes sense on the screen to me. And I suspect your answer will be quite similar in terms of if we talked about the ecology of Avatar off-screen, but I think it's worth just raising because it might be something listeners are thinking about as we're talking. there's been a movement sort of within media and film studies to talk about the sort of green impact of media. There's Richard Maxwell and Toby Miller's Greening the Media, which kind of did the rounds a few years ago, which was a really interesting attempt to kind of get us to think about the kind of material, mineral aspect of our media consumption and our media creation, and the ton of toxic, hazardous substances that we carry around in our pockets. And I don't know. I don't really have a firm view on this, because I want to avoid the fatalism that says, well, anyone that has a Twitter account has no right to have an opinion on ecology because they're using Twitter, which is ridiculous. It's like arguing that people who bought a coffee when they were occupying St Paul's were taking part in the capitalist system. That fatalism is not interesting and not helpful. At the same time, there's got to be a balance exchange kind of thought here, and we're not talking about someone using a Twitter account or using a Zoom or anything like that. We're talking about a movie that cost billions and did. I don't know the history of this particular movie very well, but certainly I know James Cameron is a figure that comes up in Maxwell and Miller's book as the carbon footprint of Titanic was pretty disastrous. Its ecological impact on the shores of Mexico was pretty disastrous. It destroyed fishing reserves and all this kind of stuff. It was it had some lasting and real wide ecological consequence. That was Titanic, which is not a movie that necessarily we could champion as having any kind of ecological message. But I just, there is a kind of another tension off screen of this movie. How much? What's the cost of making this movie, of distributing this movie, of buying DVDs of this movie, of all this kind of stuff versus its potential impact as a force for good? I thought you could,
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So, look, I think we could and should see Avatar as a kind of sequel to Titanic, in two senses. Firstly, maybe Cameron learnt a bit from Titanic about some of the mistakes not to make again. And this is not an area of my top expertise, but my understanding is that actually, certainly the carbon footprint of Avatar was way, way less. Precisely because so much of it is in the studio and is CGI and so on, and there was far, far less on location costs and actual movement of medium-sized dry goods around the world and so on and so forth. And that's an intriguing sort of hopeful fact about the film. The other sense in which I think we should see Avatar as a sequel to Titanic is I think that Titanic did have a sort of embryonic message of an ecological kind, which was to do with the melting of icebergs coming way too far south and sinking a ship for which Read a civilization that was too big to fail, and that assumed that it was unsinkable and impregnable. And our assumption that we are unsinkable and impregnable is false. Not to put too fine a point on it. And I think that what Avatar did is take that kind of idea and make it absolutely essential and pivotal to the film, and make it something that was important to be experienced. And I think it's succeeded really, very impressively in that. And I guess my hope going forward is that, absolutely, it's important to pay attention to these actual, material green aspects of media and so on, of course. But it's also important to be clear about the possibility that works like this could be somewhat game-changing on a much larger piece, on a much larger stage. And boy, do we need that kind of game-changingness. Avatar appeared coincidentally in cinemas at the exact same time as the Copenhagen Climate Summit failed us so drastically in 2009. And now here we are 12 years later, awaiting the COP in Glasgow, which I think will fail us, albeit not so drastically, and awaiting still the Avatar sequels. And of course, I've got no idea whether they're going to be any good, but I've got a bit of hope around them. And I think that if more people were to try to invest more in active hope, in some kind of project of kind of accentuating the positive in what's offered to us by films like this, in terms of a possibility of really waking up and deeply changing. And if we were to try to, as I said earlier, build something real around those, well, then maybe we would start to create a situation where there would be a little bit more hope than there currently is. Because, with my ecological hat on and looking at other books of mine, like my little book with the cheery title "This Civilization is Finished," things are pretty dire, and we need, as Jake puts it memorably towards the end of the film, we need to go to a whole nother level. I think that the films I talk about in my book, and perhaps this film in particular, all sorts of things we could bring up in potential criticism of them, obviously, but I think that they do offer us some kind of possibility of going to a whole nother level, and boy, that is exactly what we need to do.
Well, I think on that note of hope, I'll ask you. We'll attempt to wrap up, but I'll ask you just about the book more broadly. You've been kind enough to talk to us about an aspect of it, which was, I know you talk about Avatar in relation to Lord of the Rings, as you've mentioned, but a film philosophy of ecology, and enlightenment. It's broader than that, right? And actually, we haven't even got onto the sort of more philosophical aspect of it and its relationship to Wittgenstein and all this kind of stuff. So perhaps you could just give readers a sense of what else they might get from the book.
Well, yeah, so sure. If you've been enjoying the podcast, obviously, I'd encourage you to get hold of the book. You can get it from your library. It is also possible, if you're very devious, to find it much more cheaply on the worldwide interweb. Basically, it takes you through a sequence of films which I've picked because I believe that they can be read in this kind of affirmative way, and rather than kind of picking holes, which I think is all too easy to do. I look at films like Waltz with Bashir and Apocalypto and Melancholia and Solaris, 2001, Gravity, Lord of the Rings trilogy, and Avatar, and seek to understand these in a sort of philosophical and eco-political way, as giving us vicarious and real experiences of the kind of awakening and life-changing and world-changing change of vision, change of view that I think that we need. And yeah, I guess I'm pretty proud of the book, and it does connect with Wittgenstein's philosophy in ways that people might find interesting. I regard Wittgenstein as a fundamentally liberatory and ethical thinker, which is a sort of new perspective on Wittgenstein, but it's also completely accessible without any knowledge of Wittgenstein, or for that matter, really of philosophy, I hope. A lot of it is based very much in staying close to the films and finding what we can find in them, and as I put it, finding ourselves in them. I'm continuing to do some of that. I hope to do more work in this area in the future, and I'm just now writing another piece on Gravity for a volume, for example. So this continues to be an area of my interest for those of you who are of a more sort of philosophical or academic bent.
Terrific. Rupert, thanks again for coming on the podcast. You've been a terrific guest. Thanks for your time.
Cheers, no problem.
You can find us, of course, via our various social media streams. We're out in the digital sphere, selling out on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit at Fananim Research, FANANIM Research, and our website, fantasy-animation.org. You can access our blog archive and our podcast archive, as well as there's an episode on Moana where we talk a bit more about film philosophy, so if you're interested in that, you can check that out too. We talk a lot about water as well in that episode, so somewhat ecological as well. Otherwise, that's been us for another week, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Bye.